Before we get too far into it, do you want to give a little? Do you want to do a little self promotion? Maybe tell us who you are, your channel, any place people could follow you.
Yeah, of course. So I'll link that in the Discord, and I'll say it right now.
Sure.
Hi everyone. I'm Hanz of Harkir. You can call me Hans. I do nonfiction book reviews on economics and history and philosophy and politics in general. And I make a weekly book review. One that just dropped today was on the radical history of American progressivism, and how we don't have to look to the outside world in terms of like finding things that are what would be considered radical in American politics. And yeah, you can follow me on, you can sub to me on YouTube, Hans of Harkir. Same thing with Twitter. You can follow me on Reddit and Goodreads. You can see like what I'm reading right now. Yeah, that's about what I am. I'll throw those links in there right now for anyone who's interested.
Sure. And might I also say he's quite a cutie, so feel free to follow. Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm thirst trapping hard. You know, like
Oh,
Hassan, I'm coming for you. I'm ready. Like,
wearing those long sleeve like t-shirt, not t-shirts. I guess it kind of is a t-shirt, right? Like that's
I'm
the
a
key.
I'm a sweater guy. I started doing that just because like I didn't want to seem too like scary or imposing. I'm a pretty big
Hmm.
dude, and then now it just like makes me look softer. So I like that aesthetic. Nah, it's like back
My
when
man's trying to look like a soy boy over here. He's like, oh, I'm too
I
Chad for this leftist audience. Okay.
I mean not to flex, but I like before COVID, I was like 245 pounds of like just straight muscle. I was like an amateur powerlifter. I was huge, and
Oh my god.
now I'm a bit leaner. I'm still pretty big, but you know, I do more cardio. I have a big like boxing punching bag in my apartment that I use because I don't go to gyms right now because uh, COVID is awful. I got a bunch of home gym gear, so like you know those
Hmm.
little like adjustable weights and shit. And you know I'm just doing what I can because otherwise you know I'm already smaller than I was. I'm rocking at about a lean 230 right now. I'm six
Oh
three,
my god.
so it's like yeah. So just making sure that you know I don't scare anybody away. I want it to be about my ideas, you know. If I wanted to be like a true thirst trap, I would have gone with like, you know, like stringers and stuff, just showing everyone
Right.
the shoulders.
Oh my god.
God.
Well,
But
so I think that you either wanted to talk about. This was more of a discussion than a debate. You wanted to talk about either, I think, monopoly policy, international policy, or like transitions from capitalism to socialism.
yeah, absolutely. So what would you want to hit first?
Um, Honestly, your preference.
uh, I saw your last video, and you said you weren't super familiar with monopoly policy, but I think you did a pretty good job of explaining how different
Well,
collusion between like capitalist firms can really lead to like damaged markets.
so I have like the understanding I have of like monopoly is like it's literally the basic economic stuff. It's like, oh, here are the reasons that monopolies are bad from like theoretical purposes. I have very little like empirical like either reading or research on them. So that's kind of what I meant. But it sounded like you might have read a book or two on the subject.
Oh yeah. So I did research for about 2 years up with corporate strategy and power politics, primarily focusing on relations between the United States and China, like how our corporations are interacting with their corporations, what kind of things
Mm-hmm.
that patent policy affects, that sort of stuff. And then recently, I've done some pretty heavy reading on corporate charity and how it's kind of a scam, and then also the history of corporate power politics inside the United States and different times when corporations have essentially taken over our entire government. Like we meme now, but there was a time when like the most powerful businessman in the country was also the Treasury Secretary. So like
Mm-hmm.
we're not that bad just yet. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Trump is more like an incompetent capitalist class. Okay.
Yeah, it's like guys, like we kind of got lucky. I'm not sure if a smart person can like pull off like the kind of idiotic confidence that he has, but if there was like an intelligent like Andrew Mellon type that got in
Mm-hmm.
there, we'd be absolutely fucked. Like they would have already, you know, got like a 9-0 Supreme Court. They would have packed it to 15, made it like 13-3, and it would have been absolutely awful. It's just, but yeah, it's definitely
Sure.
pretty bad. So some like some background stuff for everyone
Mm-hmm.
like listening about for monopolies and stuff. So there's two uh in traditional economics. Everyone talks about like supply and demand curves and how when you
Mm-hmm.
produce things, people want to buy them, and that's how like our economic system is kind of formed. But what they what most people get when they do intro econ, like it's normally like microeconomics is
Mm-hmm.
like what most people start with. I started there. I hate it, but like sometimes you got to do it just so you can see what the dumb people are saying. But the idea
Oh
in
no.
those supply and demand curves is always an assumption that there's an infinite number of buyers and sellers, and what that
Yep.
does from an
Sorry, I'm just
economics
agreeing with you.
perspective,
Sorry.
I got you. Is that there is no power inside those systems, and what the problem with that is in any given economic situation, there's a limited number of actors, and whether it's say just a few sellers, or even like in the modern day, what's becoming more of a problem than just monopolies or like more likely oligopolies is something called a monopsony. And a
Mm-hmm.
monopsony is a single buyer as opposed to a single seller, and that's one thing like Amazon, where
Or
Amazon
Walmart, right?
could, or Walmart, yeah, these
Mm-hmm.
massive like chains where all the commerce goes through, they're like bottlenecked, and having that bottleneck means you essentially need to go through them. And what's been
Yep.
really terrifying, particularly with Amazon compared to Walmart, I haven't followed Walmart as heavily, is that Amazon allows all these small third-party sellers to go through them, but while that's happening, they see what products are doing well, and then they make their own type of product
Like
that
Amazon
competes in
brand,
the,
right?
yeah, like Amazon brand.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is there's a like a verticalization of the market where they're no longer just like being an intermediary. They're trying to control essentially commerce from start to finish. That's really terrifying in terms of how they affect the not just like the U.S. economy, but the overall global economy. I think it's something like 80% of American families have some type of Amazon membership, or they at least use Amazon. Not everyone has like Amazon Prime, but they use Amazon for things. I use Amazon, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all
like
the time.
yeah, and it's just it's dangerous, not because things will technically say be worse prices for consumers. There's actually a pretty strong history of a consumer movement in the United States in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the idea was, hey, like we like the idea of corporate monopolies because as long as they're well regulated and stuff, they should be producing things at a much lower cost than say like
Yep.
10 like 100 smaller firms. But the problem with that is once you have a dominant control over a market, and that doesn't have to be 50%, it can mean 20% or even
Yep.
15%,
Yep.
because you can just price everyone else out, and
Yep.
suddenly you control the market now, and that's not healthy for any kind of democracy or in any kind of economy, even from like if we're standing capitalism, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
not to make anyone like angry out there, comrades. I'm a suck dem. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm very sympathetic to like anarchism and like full blown socialism. But most of my work and my research is done
You
in
heard
the
the man. It's
current
time to
market economy.
compel him, okay? Okay, slide into this
Yeah.
man's DMs, okay? Tell him all about Kropotkin, okay? He's gonna love it.
Oh, I read Kropotkin. I did a book review on the Conquest of Bread, and I like it. Like I'm like anarchism sounds good. What I currently struggle with, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a bit, is about how we transition the current like
Mm-hmm.
global economy into like say a socialist economy. And I've go ahead. Sorry, I've been talking a lot.
No. It's okay. I'm glad that we got like a nice introduction. So I guess the thing that I think is interesting. So some like major SOCDEM people like Keynes have actually supported monopolization of the economy, and their argument is that it is easier for the state to regulate a small number of firms that it can more easily like know and control. That if you had more or less like corporatism, that then it would be easier for the state to control those firms by more or less incorporating them in part of the state structure. Are you sympathetic to those arguments, or are you generally in favor of the idea that like competitive markets, even if I don't know, like they're anti-Keynesian or anti-state control or whatever, are better for the consumer? Um,
I would say that at any given point,
mhm,
having a more monopolized control could benefit consumers in the short term. So like very much like Amazon is great for consumers right now, right? But
mhm,
I would agree with Keynes in theory, in the sense that if our government was an adequate regulator, right?
yes.
Like the entire
Well,
thing
well,
like
well,
would
well.
rest on the government being a better regulator. Because what I'm the difference between say what I would most likely be advocating for is like a bunch of smaller or medium-sized firms compared to a couple
Mhm,
large ones,
mhm,
is that in the absence of government, a bunch of big firms will absolutely destroy regular people or regular consumers or their employees. And but in the absence of a good a good government, like say if we lose control
mhm,
of the
mhm.
House and Senate to the Republicans every 4 or 8 years, that likely will be able to survive compared to what's happening right now, where you have Republican control of most of our federal agencies. So again, this isn't specifically Congress. I
No,
think Congress needs to like, obviously regulate more, but the idea is like, consumer financial like protection bureaus being hamstrung right now. I would much prefer a government not functioning to be overseeing a bunch of smaller actors that none of which have a either oligopic or monopolistic
Mhm.
control over like a particular market. So I understand where
You could
Keynes
even
is
think of it
coming
as like a
from.
time frame thing, right? Like if it takes 8 years to take control of a market, right? Then so long as we keep getting control of the government every 8 years and breaking them up, okay, then we're fine. We can just keep leapfrogging it. Like,
Yeah. Also, I would say I have a lot of respect for Keynes. I also have a lot of
mhm,
respect for like the people during the New Deal, and I think
mhm.
why he believes that specifically is if you look back at what we did to corporations in the New Deal, we absolutely like fucking bodied them. Like it was. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Like it, no, it was like
This
for
is a
him.
child
I'd say
friendly. This is a family friendly stream. Okay, we don't say fuck. We
I'm
don't say
just making
shit.
sure, it's that they
Go right ahead.
actively bodied some of the most powerful corporations and the most powerful businessmen in the country, and like not just
Mm-hmm.
in the country, in the world. And so, watch from his perspective, I can totally understand why he's like, hey, I want my enemies to be like, I want to be able to count them on my like two
Yep.
hands, and I can go to their office and say, hey, we're going to beat your ass with all sorts of regulations if you don't, do the right thing. But the problem now is that that doesn't exist. We don't have that kind of government impetus. We have some people, like whether it's Katie Porter or AOC or Bernie or like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Katie Porter,
Warren.
absolutely.
Yeah, and those people do a lot of good work. But until there's another strong anti-monopolistic movement inside government, then we're going to struggle with that. And that's why, in the modern sense, if I was in Keynes' time, I would be down with that idea. Right now, it's not feasible just because of the nature of our government. And it's actually really interesting. There's some tech hearings recently where there's actually kind of it's strange bedfellows bipartisanship where it's not like just a regular Washington inside stuff. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you have some Democrats which are legitimately anti like monopoly, and they
Mm-hmm.
do good work. But there's also a really like hokey dorky string of anti-monopolistic Republicans, and the only reason they're anti-monopolistic is because they think all like the big tech companies are
Yep. 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 Yep.
oppressing them, and it's like this very strange thing where they're like, yeah, we have to stop monopoly power, and I'm just like, you're just
Sure.
mad because like they're banning you from Twitter for like like
Mm-hmm.
trying to incite hate crimes. Like I don't know what you want me to say. Like
Poor conservatives being censored for their views about taxation and spending policies. Surely, surely. It couldn't be about anything else. Well,
nothing else.
so I guess I guess the reason I brought up Keynes is it actually so one of the answers to the question of how you do that transition that when I was reading Bernstein, who is like a reformist social, he was called a social democrat. Today he'd be called a socialist. Um, one of his suggestions is that the state cannot reasonably, like, say, nationalize a lot of small firms because it doesn't have the existing infrastructure to like administer all of those small firms. So he suggests that it's actually a good thing if you want nationalization that the firms get more and more like centralized. So were you to want like a nationalized internet, then you might want like Facebook and Google and so on to be these enormous centralized firms rather than 50 tiny firms. Um, and so I don't know what your positions are on like these various like economic areas. I don't know what you think about the internet, but in general, I do tend to think that since we aren't going to nationalize these firms in the near future, as far as I can tell, I would prefer them be weak. So very strongly sympathize with that.
No, you're totally right in that if we can't nationalize them, I would prefer them to be in a state of weakness. And the
Yep.
way I would say you would like push towards that is, in my opinion, I don't believe that we can nationalize, like, say, all industry or all like of the biggest industries. I think there's some key industries that obviously need nationalization, whether it's healthcare. I'm a personal big fan of making like defense
Mm-hmm.
nationalized. I don't like the idea of profit for weapons of mass destruction. Like I really think that's pretty immoral and disgusting.
Yep.
And
It also
I
has
also
somewhat
don't.
questionable outcomes there because it's one of those areas where you have a monopsony. It usually where it's mostly like the either the federal government or the federal government and foreign federal governments buying stuff. So it's very few buyers. So it's hard to say that there's effective competition in such a market. Um,
Absolutely. And so I would say part of what would be weakening these forms, if we can't say break them up, right?
mhm.
There's I have a pretty radical position in the sense that I'm
Uh-oh.
not a big fan. I'm not. Yeah, I know. Everyone, get ready.
Mhm.
It sounds boring when we talk about like
The
revolution
radical
stuff,
sucked
but
him. Okay, the radical sucked him.
I,
I'm not a
nah,
revolutionary. I'm a reformist. So I don't know.
it's
My radicalism is probably only slightly more than yours.
I gotcha. It's I'm not a big fan of American patent policy,
Mm,
with very few exceptions. Like in the case of say like content creators or like book writers or people with like IP in terms of storytelling stuff. I really don't like how we deal with patents, whether it's it allows for control of the market by different pharmaceutical industries. I don't like pharmaceutical patents like very
sure.
often, especially if they're like made with American taxpayer money. I think one of the
Mm,
easiest things that we could do that in no way would be like unconstitutional or anything is that we make like a rule where any like if we fund the entirety of the creation of a drug or even like over 50% of a drug, we could
mhm.
say that 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 patent becomes like public product. Like no one's allowed to patent it, right? So we just have instantly a shit ton of generics, and that would
Yep.
lower cost of like drugs like by crazy amounts and that sort of
So that
thing.
is
I would
actually
also
something I wanted to ask a little bit about. So your suggestion is that for the public funding ones, that we maybe like eliminate patents, and I can certainly understand that one because in those ones we're providing the funding for patents, right? We are providing the impetus for the market, the private firms to actually do the innovation. Do you think this is a more general strategy? Like, what is your general position on patents? I guess is the take. And
I actually I actually don't like them specifically for I'd say for consumer reasons, but also for national security esque reasons. What I mean by that is, with the exception of say like weapons of war, which I think those should be like obviously those patents should be hidden and stuff.
Mhm,
Our American current patent law actually makes American firms much less competitive compared to say like Chinese firms. And what I mean by that is there's actually something that happened like I'm sure everyone in your audience remembers like the bullshit with like the China trade war between Trump and China. And
mhm,
part of why they got mad about that was specifically you have Chinese firms stealing American patents, right? And so there's actually a very interesting idea where they follow a certain one of my other specialties is like a history of U.S. China relations. And
mhm,
what they do have done recently is so our corporations can't use each other's patents, right? So we have a
mhm.
technological disadvantage there. But China can, and they have all of their patents. So if we
Wake up,
respect patent law
niggas.
and they
Get
don't,
over
all
here.
of our firms are now less competitive, and
Basically,
they can
yes.
undercut.
Though the fundamental the critique of this would be, well, let's say that what you say is true, so all of the Chinese firms can use all of the Chinese patents and the American patents. Well, then shouldn't it be just the case that we want all American firms to use all American patents and then systematically deny them to China as much as possible? um,
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. If that was in a
well, then
like
I guess the
obviously
question is, how do you protect those sort of things without a patent framework, right? How do you preserve like IP without patents?
right. I would say that currently patent protection is pretty
Mhm.
like dodgy anyway, where it's like any good that's produced in China is that the secret of like that creation for that product is obviously is going to be like found out by the Chinese government. There's a a
Sure.
very long treasured history of like relationships between the government and the Chinese corporations. So when I say that, I think it's not so much like say fixing the problem in that we're not going to be able to stop China from taking our patents, but it will
Hmm.
make our firms more competitive because it means all our firms can like work together and have like sort of open source. You know what I mean? Like when we all can work on the same sort of stuff, and it doesn't stop you from building something because you don't have a contract with, say, I don't know, Google, right? I saw a really
Sure.
great tweet the other day where it's like hey, we can't. The reason why Siri is such a terrible operating like like voice assistant is because it's tied into Apple OS, like iOS. And if you had like say a true open source sort of like platform or program,
Hmm.
that means we would have a bunch of like really solid voice things that could fit with Apple, and that's something that I would like. In the idea of, I like the idea of technology sharing. I like the idea of that, and I don't think we're going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, like per se, in the sense of international trade, because like we use China for
Hmm.
so much like production. That the best thing we can do to compete is like leveling the playing field in the sense that giving our guys more access to more options, right?
So
So
what I had expected you to say was actually that it would be a soft power move. That if we gave the like if we like removed patents on a lot of these production processes and then we enabled them to like other like for other like regional allies like Vietnam or Korea, um, right? Then those nations would be like more inclined towards the United States and they would be more competitive against China. That's what I was expecting you to say. And
oh,
actually,
that
sorry, go ahead.
that also fits like in the same way. Like I don't think what I said and what you just like described are in any way contradictory. They're just like two
Nope.
parts of like of argumentation. Like if we were writing a paper together, right? Like that would be
Sure.
like paragraph one and paragraph two. And I think that makes
Yeah,
a lot of
Hans and
sense. Like
SDL.
if
Okay.
uh, yeah, and
Hmm.
you make a, like you make a really good point at that, and that's something that I think about a lot in terms of say like how we like pressure China like to do like better things in terms of like human rights violations and stuff. Like I don't know if you have any tankies in
Yep.
chat and stuff, but like I'm just so you know like
Probably
communist
do.
China for state capitalist China, it's not a fun place. You know what I mean? Like it's like I don't like their
Hmm.
leaders. I don't like how they treat like their ethnic minorities. And I think that dealing with them would we've demonstrated that we cannot deal with them unilaterally. Like they're too big now, right? It's like you have the
Hmm.
largest economy in the world, which is only like was like 20 something percent of like the global like GDP, but then
Hmm.
they're like the second biggest. So it's like back when, say, like in the 70s, when we were almost half like the global economy, we could do that. We could choose winners and losers unilaterally, even though we didn't like always do that because we had like a stronger relationship with Europe and stuff, or like
Hmm.
Western Europe. But now they're too big. And so one of the biggest failures of Trump's trade war, like I'm personally not a protectionist. I have a whole
Sure.
like spiel of like of trade, and
Well, that
what
makes two.
I yeah, and I don't like I didn't like that specifically because it was destined to fail, right? Like that you
Hmm.
had one economy that tried to shut out, say, like parts of the Chinese economy, and it just didn't work because China could trade with other places, and other places that were connected with China didn't like them. I think the best way of getting them to do something would be to just have us, and at the very least the European Union, and to have us be able to do like a broad multilateral like pressure to make them have like whether better worker practices to raise the standard of living for their
Yep.
people, or like those are the things
Well,
that
and
like
that's
I
sorry.
oh, go ahead. No, you
I
go.
was just
Sorry.
gonna I was just gonna say part of like that was part of the TPP. It was also include a lot of like very questionable provisions about intellectual property, um, for example. But like part of the purpose of the TPP was actually supposed to be so that competitors with China would have more or less this internal like more free market, and so it would be more possible for them to trade with each other and therefore to like have more power against China. And so I think it's kind of an interesting thing that you bring up that like you need economic power to resist other economic power, um, which I think relates a little bit. You were mentioning earlier, like a little bit about like firms just opposing the like, U.S. interest, right? That like large capital would oppose U.S. interests, and so you really do need to have like a lot of power, either in the government or in a set of governments to oppose like large capital power or large bad state actor power.
Right, absolutely. And I know that might make like certain anarchists sad, and I like, but right now in the case of like the global economy or the
Yep.
global like international like political situation, you kind of need if we're going to have state actors, I would prefer them be positive state actors, right? And I'm not in any way standing for the U.S. in terms of what we've done or like what we're currently doing,
Mm-hmm.
right? What I mean is if we could make our foreign policy and our nation a more positive actor, that's good for
Mm-hmm.
everybody. Like maybe instead of destroying all South American socialist movements and installing fascists, we'd only do that to every other one. You know what I mean?
That was actually
That's
something I
what I
was
was.
going to mention in specific relation to foreign policy and patents. There was this historical example in India where India in the 60s, after decolonization, was trying to build steel factories, domestic steel factories. And so they had three firms do it, one from Germany, one from the USA, and one from the USSR, actually. And so the interesting thing is that the USSR one, even though it was technically inferior, the plant was technically inferior because they had worse steel production technology than did Germany or did like the USA. But it was constructed, I want to say, within like 1 year, and the other ones took 3 or 4 years, and they had cost overruns and like a whole bunch of failures. And part of the success of it was they literally just took workers from India, moved them to the USSR, which had no patents on those sort of things internally, had them work in the same plants that they would eventually be building in India. Those workers then went back to the plant, helped construct it, and help operate it. And so, in a system where you have much, much, much less protection on intellectual property and like trade secrets, it is much easier to do that sort of soft power diplomacy where you improve the economies abroad in turn to benefit your like diplomacy and your internal economy.
Oh no, everything you said, I completely agree with. There's a, I'm not sure if I just did a review on this recently. It was with the Radical Reviewer. It was on Democracy at Work by Richard Wolff, and he specifically talks about this on a national scale, in the sense that even inside a national economy, if you
True.
have like free flow of people between like working places and stuff, and free flow of patents, you have people that are all like benefiting like
Mm-hmm.
100% from these advancements. So there's no desire to hide them in the case of, say, competition against that like makes things less efficient for everybody. So I think if we're ever going to say actively, get every non like every like third world country, like I'm not sure like what we're supposed to call them now. Like,
The
like, if we
global
get
south.
like the global south, like the
Mm-hmm.
underdeveloped countries, if we're ever
Mm-hmm.
going to get them up to a modern like say welfare state like esque place, like where
Mm-hmm.
most of like America is, where Europe is. Sorry, America's like we're
Sure.
we're sliding back, but if we're ever going to get them up, we have to be able to allow them to have their own sort of production. This is something that's really sad, is that for so long we've just, exploited them for natural resources and never like let them really build anything. And then all of a sudden, they just never improve, and it's like we wonder why. And this is something that's I'd say so frustrating for me, is that I want leftists to be in like these positions of power to make these world like decisions, right? Like how we have the World Bank and other international like monetary institutions, and they very much have not been like doing very well in terms of like
no, the World Bank is generally not promoting like transfer of patents from the rich to the poor world to improve the poor world's standing. It's generally in favor of like extremely strong IP law and like austerity measures rather than like any sort of form of like domestic development.
Absolutely, and this is actually something that's really important in terms of soft power, like we were talking about earlier. Have you heard of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative?
Absolutely. I literally have some studies that it works. Like it changes people's minds in the countries where they invest. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, because they're crushing it. Like because like this is they go in, they build all their infrastructure, they use Chinese labor, and they create, it's like an empire of debt, right? Because they make these countries pay for their infrastructure. And like, yes, like, I would say if we ever trying to compete with that, we'd have to provide the same thing at like a better deal, right? We'd have to like say provide their infrastructure in a way that doesn't cripple them or tie them to Chinese debt for the next 50 years. But what's happening, and like what I said, where we're losing and how they're getting a strategic advantage over like say the United States and like Western Europe, is that they're willing to do this knowing that they're going to like making short-term losses. And this is something that's actually
short-term losses, long-term gains, right? But then we can't do that because like for one, our administration just doesn't seem to think that way ever, and for two, like the U.S. firms don't seem to think that way, right? So like nobody's actually doing that.
Well, it's not that they don't think that way. It's I would say it's systemic in that they can't. And so what I mean by that is you can have a Chinese firm and the government says, hey, we want to improve like relations with say Guatemala, right? And so they're going to we need you to invest in this country, and you're going to take a loss for 3 years, and then you come back, and suddenly now Guatemala is in debt and like in heavy relation to China, whereas an American firm could not have like weathered the loss of those 3 years of. And this is a big thing of just like in general where it's like subsidized capital versus unsubsidized capital, and that's the largest possible scale. But it happens like in regular economics as well. It's like if you want to start a startup and challenge Amazon or like Standard Oil did this, and same thing in the 19th century, where they would just sell below market rate to crowd out the market. And so it's actually really funny that this is happening to American firms now, because the biggest American firms have done this to the smallest American firms for the longest like period of time. And
but now at an international level, it's happening exactly to them.
and this is why I'm not a big fan of. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, finish.
And this is why I'm not a big.
You're way too polite. Okay.
And this is. I'm trying to hold myself back. I was scary, I promise. And then it's like, and the idea is that I don't like concentrated power, but if it has to be like power, if power has to exist, I want it to be either democratized or diluted or diversified, right? And what scares me so much about state capitalism in the case of China is that they're so much better at it than like private capital, because they have this. Whereas modern, like where American corporations, and this is something to their effectiveness. I'm not praising like their methods or anything. It's just that they're more efficient than us, and that our corporations are always working for the short-term profits of like quarterly like projections for their stock, right? For the stockholder meetings, the shareholder meetings, and they can't make these long-term strategic decisions that would say like a benefit like long-term like national strategy. And again, like I'm not a big fan of ever doing that, but it just seems in the current context, like privatized firms doing whatever they want and trying to compete with China, and like our government competing with China's government, when China's government like has like the lock on their corporations and can encourage like these sorts of investment, we're always going to lose, because one, they can make these long-term strategies that we just can't, and two, their government like orders the corporations as opposed to like our government, where the corporations kind of order our government. So like it's backwards, and it's really showing in terms of competition between the two countries.
Well, sure. So then I guess the relevant question there, and to try and move a little bit towards like the third topic we'd mentioned, is what solutions would change that? So we've mentioned patents, right? And what additional like solutions do you, as a social democrat or like leftist, or I suppose like an anarchist-leaning social democrat, support in like moves to try and make corporations think long-term, moves to make like say like either help improve democracy in the United States, because it would be nice if, in addition to being very powerful, the United States was also a very strong power for democracy and leftism. So like how do we change the United States to achieve these goals? What like concrete policies are you talking about? One example actually would just be for like patent policy. Do you have a preferred alternative to current patent policy?
Yes. So, in like simple terms for patent policy, is
Mm-hmm.
that I haven't checked for other industries yet, but I like for pharmaceuticals and for technology to be
Mm-hmm.
open source at this point to try and encourage a sort of collaboration where like different parts fit together better and allow smaller firms to start up and like maybe build something with what already exists instead of like keeping them out and using like this the small number of open source stuff that we currently have. I think that would make us more
Sure.
competitive
So
as as a
that would
country.
help with the already existed products. So basically, the question then is, how do you encourage firms to still produce new products? How do you still encourage innovation?
Oh, well, you'll keep making more money. This goes into long. If I had to like say, like, give you like a list of say policies in terms of what I think will work together to collaboratively improve the situation. So we have the initial patent changes, but then I
Mm-hmm.
very much like the idea of workplace democracy because the problem right now in terms of publicly traded corporations for shareholders is that they have to make quarterly profits. I
Mm-hmm.
would say in worker self-directed enterprises, you would have much more long-term thinking because these people work and own the company together. So
Sure.
there's no outside capital that encourages like short-term gains for long-term strategic losses. So those two
Well,
things would be. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just to stay a little bit on patents, so I totally agree with the worker cooperative thing. We can get that in a moment. I just want to, on like patents specifically, there's the argument is basically, let's say even we have a worker cooperative firm and they are thinking long term. It costs a lot of money to develop a drug, and it takes a long time to make that money back. Like I think the estimate is that it costs somewhere between $1 to $2 billion to generate a new drug, and not all new drugs are successful. To be fair, a lot of those that fail early on, so you're not talking about the full cost of like $1 billion, but it is a large expenditure. Um, so basically, the question is like, how do you ensure that they still do R&D, that they're still encouraged to do R&D, um,
Right.
without patents, without them getting money from it, or as
So
much money?
I would So, in terms of like again, I'd say this is more radical in terms of
Mm-hmm.
developing these products. I would say the best way of encouraging better like technology or like producing these goods and like continuing to innovate, right? I would leave the innovation process largely to like universities, like public universities, public technical institutes to create these things and whatever say like a new patent is developed by a corporation, I would almost always recommend like depending on how like useful it is or for the government to like out the patent or like buy out like how much like work and labor they put into that, like buy it out of them and then like put it on the market for everybody to use, right? So like to keep
Mm-hmm.
adding to the toolbox of open source. So I would say
Sure.
like in our current system, the best way of like getting that is like I said, have the majority of research done through public universities. We'd have
Well
like
then,
obviously we do. Oh, good.
well, I just wanted to say, so this I don't disagree with this at all. Like, I think research in pharmaceutical right now is 40% public, and it used to be more like 60% public. But I guess the suggestion then is that fundamentally what you're proposing is a shift from R&D in firms to a shift of R&D in like research institutions, right?
Yes.
Publicly funded R&D, almost to the eliminate like private firms might do R&D, but it would almost certainly significantly decrease in the system.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
and I say that has an added benefit for all of my favorite peeps that are afraid of authoritarianism that
Mm-hmm.
we've diversified power, right? So now because what
Yep.
was one of the most dangerous and like the best I'd say example of this is aluminum. So the aluminum company of America essentially controlled 90% of the world's aluminum supply in the early part of the 20th century, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was owned by one guy. It was controlled essentially by one man, and that was awful. Like he sabotaged the initial like war efforts for the United States in fighting Nazi Germany. He sold aluminum to the Nazi Germany. He sold it
Mm-hmm.
to like fascist Italy. Like this sort of concentrated patent power can be absolutely terrifying and dangerous. And I
Sure.
don't like the idea. And it's one thing for me to say for if you have like a one product that you control the market. I already don't like that. But what scares me is that you have say something like Google, who
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
only has a complete lock on the search browser market, but they have other technologies, right? I don't like any one firm or any one person having that level of control over an economy. And it seems like the best way to fix that is really just, decrease the size of individual firms and
Right. So instead
leave.
of Google, now it's like Google One with their search engine, Google Two, YouTube, those sort of things. Is that your suggestion,
Yeah,
or?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea. I love the idea of diversifying those and
I,
having
I mean,
oh, go
I'm
ahead.
pretty sure that YouTube loses money, so we can actually get into that. But like, that one might be a failure for, but the rest of them probably would work pretty successfully.
Oh, so I would say in those specific cases, again,
Hmm.
this is much more like a government planning stuff, where if individual products like would make money, right? And I'm not saying every single firm can only have one function. I think that would get kind of like tedious very quickly. But I don't like the idea of like specific, extremely powerful products. And YouTube, like I would say, YouTube, cesspool that it is like a
Hmm.
general good. Like it's like a nice public forum for people like to state their ideas and like do what they want to do. And so when you try to fix that, or you want to be not owned by a monopolistic like tech giant, I say the best way would be to make it like akin to a public utility, right? Like if we're saying, because I am in favor of this, the idea of like government sponsored like free fast internet to like every American, right?
Sure.
Because you kind of need it to exist in the modern context. Because
Yeah.
most people like,
Well, and if
and
even
so
if it's not a need, it would like one significantly improve a lot of people's lives, and two, it would actually increase like labor mobility or like labor access. More people could do remote jobs. More people could find remote jobs. They could like do remote learning, that kind of stuff. So it's like it's indirectly an active labor market program.
no, and you're absolutely right. So I like that
Well,
concept if we're
glad we
trying
agree
to
on
like
everything.
no, like this. I knew this wasn't going to be a debate. Like I felt like
Hmm.
I saw your stuff and I was like I mean, yeah. So how we deal with say this is actually something
Based.
that I deal with a lot as a based as a someone who cares very much about these like social and economic issues, but also has a broader grasp of international politics and understanding, right? Because like
Hmm.
if we say neuter to the United States and make sure that we like don't really interact with the world at all, or we like lower our place again, like I'm not like
Like return
like
to
say
isolationism is what you're is what you're
yeah
talking about.
yeah I don't
Hmm.
I don't like the idea of return to isolationism because there are other actors that are bad, like
Hmm.
like everyone memes like on
Well,
Russia
I
and
think
China and stuff,
usually
but
the way that I put this is it's not that they are bad; it's that they are worse, right? It's a relative thing.
yes,
So because I would also
absolutely.
you could also argue that the United States is bad, right? Depending on who you're talking
Oh
to,
yeah, we
they're bad
absolutely
or
are.
yeah, or like somewhere between neutral and bad, right? Probably not on the good. That one's a harder question, but worse definitely. It seems like Russia and China both like they promote authoritarianism. Russia seems to promote like pretty capitalist policies. China is also totally okay with like capitalism. They are not like leftist or democratic. It doesn't seem like in their foreign policy.
Right. And so what that leaves like me thinking, right, is that if we democratize our corporate sector, right, like our
Hmm.
economy, and we like whether through patent policy or the worker co-ops like we talked about, or
Hmm.
like a diversification of like people like owning certain like powerful institutional products, that means
Hmm.
our corporations, which are already like really bad at like fighting like Chinese corporations, right, or like or like Chinese economic like endeavors, is that it has to fall on our federal government. Like our federal government has to be the thing that is dealing with like economic diplomacy, economic like haggling, like, and
Hmm.
also I would say, and like that's extremely important. And I would say it's better than our current like policy, because right now it's like every corporation for themselves, and they're all giants like in the sense compared to regular people, but none of them can withstand China, and with
No,
very few
they simply don't have the
exceptions.
same deep pockets, right? Like if the comparison is Amazon, right, is able to spend under the market because it's a really big firm, so it's able to take out an individual smaller firm. China we can consider as like the mega firm, right? If it is the one big firm that runs China de facto.
Absolutely. And
Sure.
so what I and so what we're trying to like say to fix that, right? Without because my the idea is I want America to not become what China is, right? Like I don't like
Hmm.
that idea like massive authoritarianism. And so
I
I'm
mean,
trying to
basically,
figure
then
out
all the three powers of the world, right? America's like half democratic, China's barely democratic, Russia's barely democratic, and they're all China's like state capitalists, and the other two are just like non-state capitalists. Then, if you finally had the United States be non-democratic and like highly capitalist, then all three major powers of the world would be pushing for those. It would be like extremely frightening. I suppose the EU might cobble together like an army or something, but I,
I don't trust
they
the
might also go
Europeans.
fascist. So I don't know. They
Yeah,
might
oh
just
my gosh, like don't even get me started. It's like
yeah.
it's like
I don't want to trust Poland with saving democracy for the world. I don't want to trust Hungary or Italy right now.
it's like
Um,
yeah, and so it is. I think it is a really interesting question that a lot of lefties don't really want to. I'd say grapple with, or people to the left of suckdems, right? So
mhm,
I've had conversations like with harder socialists and commies and stuff, and
sure.
like to each their own. But how are we going to get to our like our proletariat revolution if in the process we cede the world to a state capitalist entity that is very negative, right? So like we have
Yep.
to try and like balance those two things happening at the same time, and it's very difficult, right? So I
Well,
think go ahead.
I was just going to say, so to talk about that a little bit, I think that often what you run into when you talk to like quote unquote tankies or people who are more like anti-United States is you get this sort of deontic logic, like using deontology. Your mug says philosophy department. I don't know what your degree is.
I have it's like I essentially graduated with 6 minors and 0 majors. My major was no, it's
kind of cool. It's kind of cool. I like it.
I took a spattering. My technical degree, my degree is in public policy, history, and philosophy. But I also took approaching like minors of like calculus, physics, and engineering.
Thanks
so
for the
I have
sub.
a pretty,
Okay, really
like,
appreciate it.
I essentially am the most interesting person to talk to at a party, but I am unemployable as fuck. So it's like,
well, I mean, you got to weigh your priorities. Well, so I guess it sounds like probably then you understand what deontology is.
yeah.
So generally, so lefties are statistically more likely to be utilitarians than righties are. But what I often find when talking to tankies is there's this sort of deontic logic where it's the U.S. has done bad things, the U.S. is a bad actor, the U.S. isn't a full democracy, therefore U.S. bad. You can't support the United States. There is no like comparative like comparison of the United States to Russia, comparison of the United States to like China or something. It basically just becomes like I reject that as bad rather than I support that as least bad, which I think also ties into why a lot of them don't vote, right? They don't want to vote for the lesser two evils.
Right. And I understand philosophically like the axioms like that make sense, right? Like everyone is bad, so it encourages you to really do nothing, right? Like you're criticizing everyone. Like you're firing like every single side. You're like, all these actors are all bad, so like I will not sully my hands. And I think for me it's more of a personal thing in the sense of why I don't like that. Like in my darkest moments, like when Bernie dropped out and all that sort of shit, I was like, God damn it, like burn it all down. Like it's never gonna work. And then
that's right. You heard it here first. Hans is a soft boy crying as Bernie left, tears streaming down his face, down his 300 pounds of rippling muscle. Okay.
I was screaming, and then I like jammed pre-workout and went to the gym. It was like, God damn it! But
he bought the punching bag, put like a Joe Biden face on it, but now he stands Biden as all good sock dems should.
It's just like it's like fuck. I hate him so much, but like if half his platform actually gets passed, it's gonna be pretty good. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Not to go into too much of a tangent of it, but there were some really interesting articles about how many Democrats were already on board with $15 minimum wage and his housing policy. So I really hope we see change there. For all we know, the United States might become fascist in like 27 days or whatever, but
yeah, dear God.
Pretty fine. So I guess return to the international policy stuff. Yes. So you were in a bad moment after Bernie lost, and then
I just I watch Vosh pretty regularly, so I saw one of his streams. No. I know. I'm sorry. And it is like, for all of his flaws, of which there are many, I liked what he said. Really galvanized me in the sense of like, hey, it's better. And then I saw your video actually about like how Biden is in the center of the Democratic Party. Like he's almost perfectly in the center, right? So if we just keep pushing the Democratic Party farther left, he will move with it, hopefully, right? Because like it seems like oh, go ahead.
I will say so. That metric that it uses there is somewhat questionable. But so basically, so I don't want to get too deep into it. The metric that I pointed to show that he's in the center is called DW nominate, which more or less shows like likelihood that you'll vote with the Dems versus the Republicans, which isn't always a great metric. You might have heard. Did you watch the vice presidential debate?
Yes.
Did you hear when Pence called Kamala the most liberal member of the Senate? I think.
Yes, and I know why. And
it's because of that DW nominate, because she was such a consistent partisan Democrat. So like AOC, for example, is actually rated as very low on the DW nominate thing because she often voted against the Democratic Party because she'll like oppose Pelosi to the left. So all this is to say, it's not a perfect metric. It does generally correlate well with other metrics of how liberal or conservative someone is. And I think I pointed to a few of other of those. Anyway, the point is like, it is broadly correct that Biden is maybe like somewhere between 1/3 conservative and like halfway conservative in the Democratic Party. So like, I totally agree.
Right.
Sorry, you're right.
I got you. And then so when I'm trying to think of like what kind of things I want to support or like who I want to push, right? This is why I feel like most of us have kind of taken the gloves off a bit in terms of criticizing Biden, is because we realize he's our best shot to stop, American fascism, right? Like
Basically, yeah.
it's all we, yeah. And how what I guess what bothers me is with the anthology people is
Hmm.
that I don't like the idea of leaving something like just because it can't I can't be perfect, right? It's like before
Sure.
it's like a personal example. It's like but right when COVID hit, right? I was about to do my first like amateur powerlifting meet. Like I was like
Hmm.
I was jacked to the tits. I was ready to like like move some serious weight. And then
Hmm.
COVID happened. I was like, shit, I can't go to the gym anymore. And I was like, okay, so like I still want to be fit, right? So I fucking hate running, but I picked up like jogging and like
Hmm.
like all sorts of like push up workouts, and like I started learning how to do handstands and shit. And I hate it, right? Like I don't like it at all. Like all these things, like I would rather be in the gym, but I can't do that right now. But doing that is better for me and better for my body, and like I like that more than doing absolutely nothing, right? I don't like the idea of doing absolutely nothing in terms of like if I can make a choice, right? Like if pulling the lever for Biden, and I do like I will vote in a swing state, so like that matters to me, right? Like
Hmm.
I understand their perspective more if you're in like such a crazy deep blue state or deep red state that it doesn't matter.
Sure.
But I don't live in that situation, and if someone say lives in a circumstance where they're not in that situation, I think it's much less justifiable. And I don't, and like I'm sure like the
Sure.
ontologists like have their own like spectrums. I'm very much like a relativist in terms of like what I think is good versus bad, right? Like
Hmm.
do I not like the public option? No, I really don't. I think there's a lot of systemic issues that our private companies will push people on to it, and that will be bad. But like, will it absolutely give tens of millions more people healthcare? Yes. So it's like it's you have to judge every like most situations like on their individual merits. And I have an overall guiding philosophy of like that I want to help people, right? And so
Sure.
between that and my
Yeah,
relativism,
embrace true utilitarianism. Okay, you got to do it
yeah.
right now.
Oh God, like I mean,
We don't need to get too deep into the weeds here.
yeah.
Sure. So
I,
I generally
I,
agree with like. Sorry, I think you might be.
I, I got you. Sorry. Yeah. I got a degree in it, but like, hey, philosophy is like was the least favorite part of my like college studies. Like, oh my god, I took like a meta ethics class, wanted to break my head open. It was so bad. Like, I mean, I had a
I know
lovely
that.
teacher, but I just don't. So many things. I understand like the desire to like act like ground everything in your axioms, right? And I
Mhm.
kind of sort of do that, but I feel like most conversations with the exception of at the beginning where you're finding out where someone stands, you don't
Mhm.
need to do that, right? Like if we talk about healthcare, we don't both need to like lay out our entire ideology of like what we want the world to be. We can say, hey, these are my arguments, and like if we're curious, we can say like, oh, where are you coming from on that issue specifically, right? I think sometimes like you said, people get too much into the weeds and you lose the overall conversation of like what are we
Sure.
actually doing?
No, there is a common like among people who know a lot of philosophy, it is very common that whenever you have a
Hello,
discussion about
neighbor.
policy,
Hello.
it'll like pivot over to talking about like the moral reasons why you believe in something. Now, I do maybe not quite as strongly agree with you on this one. I do think it's actually pretty important to get the general moral outline of why someone supports something, because then that can like show them. Contradictions in their beliefs. Like if someone wants to maximize freedom or something, then their arguments against a particular policy might be different. I know that the reason that I disliked, so I've never done formal philosophy studies, so I can't hate on it too much. I did debate in high school, and the thing that just made me mad about discussions about like various moral theories was just how often stuff isn't based in like logical arguments. It's just based on we have this big file full of like responses to utilitarianism, and literally 50% of them from like 25 different philosophers are just, well, Hitler used utilitarianism to justify killing the Jews or some dumb shit like that. Like, no, he didn't, and like, it doesn't matter anyway. Anyway,
I know
all
what
this
you
is to
mean,
say
and
that sure, go ahead.
I can give you that grounding things and axioms is important for I would say like living a relatively like consistent life. Like it's very weird to
Mm-hmm.
me when there's people that are like crazily heterodox, like someone who's like, yeah, like I'm totally for like I would say like liberation of like African Americans, but like screw Native people. It's like what do you mean? Like I feel like that's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
completely like randomly inconsistent, and it's kind of frustrating for me like to deal with that. And there are times where I've not I like stop conversation with people because I'm like, what are your axioms? Can you
Yeah.
explain like where you're coming from? And they can't do it. I'm just like, what do you there's
Well,
nowhere for me to go here because it's all
this is kind of
fields.
the one thing that I do like a little bit about Destiny is I don't know that he always does it well, but I do like the at least the idea of trying very hard to make sure that you're consistent um, in like you in the policies you're promoting or the ideals that underlie those policies. I very much do like that, and so there's this phrase "morally lucky," which I think applies to a lot of people like on the left or on the right or whatever. That they kind of they chose those morals because they were raised that way, they saw content that aligned that way, rather than like consistently coherently arriving at that conclusion.
Right. And I think it's weird where I feel like a lot of us, like, God bless, we all, like, we're 100% rational actors, but I think but I think consistently challenging your ideology and seeing like the flaws in it, and like where you
Mhm,
like understanding other like points of view, like the Jedi are evil, but like
mhm,
the idea is, I think, making sure that you talk to people who disagree with you, but like in a way that challenge your ideas as opposed to like you just screaming them at each other. Like there's like it's not like I realize this. Like I had a conversation with someone who calls himself a libertarian, but like they're definitely like authoritarian, like leaning into fascist. And at some point I was just like, we can't have a conversation. Like there's nothing about you that helps me. You know what I mean? There's nothing
sure.
about this that we can have a serious conversation about because our axioms are so entirely different, and it feels like you're lying to me, right? When
Hmm.
we're talking about, say, like I would say an axiom that's important to me would be, say, freedom, right? But that's such a
Sure.
loose term, and so how do I like define that? I would say it's that someone has freedom from pain, freedom from want, freedom from like starvation, right?
Hmm.
And those things, um, it's not just, say, people leaving you alone or no one shooting you, right? It also
Hmm.
means like, how do we get this person food? How do we get them shelter? Like all sorts of stuff. Give them like something meaningful in their lives so they don't like aren't super depressed and want to die, right? And
Hmm.
so all of these, it's fresh. Like it's hard for me because yes, you can break everything down to like these are like the things that I care about the most, but in the execution of them, everything gets super messy, right? Because you're like, all right, so I want to encourage freedom, but then like, oh, so like taxation means now we have to like take a certain thing
Yeah.
from everybody, right? And like there's always going to be compromises, and I think
This is
personally,
that's actually there's a philosopher I want to say not Nozick, it's not Bostrom. Well, I think Bostrom makes this argument that when you are doing public policy, because it affects so many people, there will be by its nature compromise. That's one of his arguments actually for using utilitarianism or some sort of like compromise based framework that you're talking about when assessing public policy. That you can't just look at it in a deontic view. Like you can't just say I oppose this bill that provides like 60% of people cheap housing because I only support bills that give 100% of people public housing. You have to do it in like a sort of comparative sense, a like a compromise sense.
yeah, and I would say I would agree with that because that feels like the best way to get things done, right? Because if we wait for the perfect opportunity, it's never like I don't think it's going to happen, and I'm not saying that I'm not like for like more radical stuff, right? Like I'll take what I can get, and like I haven't seen like a proposal by a United States representative that's too far left for me. You know what I mean? So like I'm good with most shit that's like getting pushed through right now. I wish it would go further is my issue. So until we get to that point, I don't I don't see an issue. And I get that like it's disappointing for people, especially people that are significantly to like the left of even me. Like I'd say like I'm more left than like Sanders on like a good amount of stuff, but like at some point I would like a nationalized healthcare system, like not just nationalized insurance. So like
Mm-hmm.
those sort of things like make sense to me. And but I also, like I said, I really do like whatever name, like Bosch, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
like that idea that you have to be willing to get partial victories because everything is always going to be partial victories. Like I don't think there's ever going to be like a clean and shut bill that solves
No,
like
there
all
never will be.
yeah,
Almost
and
certainly
so
not.
again, like I'm not making an argument for like bullshit triangulation, right? I'm not saying that like that's the goal. I'm saying that might be the effect, and that's what I would say like that's my biggest critique of like modern Democrats is that they almost see like triangulation as an end into
And in
itself, right? They're like,
itself.
oh,
Yep.
I want to be in the middle, as opposed to saying this is where I want to go, and this is what you're giving me, so I will take this, but we're not finished yet,
I
and
will
that's
say
like
that often feels like the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is that the Republicans are willing to like say centrist lines and lie about their like long-term goals and stuff. Like they won't actually commit to saying I want to ban abortion. Pence didn't do it. Amy Coney Barrett won't say it, but she's very much in favor of doing so because they know they have to do so to play the centrist game to get over to their actual goals. Um,
Yeah, and I'd say something that like that benefits leftists compared to like Republicans, or is that we don't have to lie about our ideas to get
Because they're
like
popular. They aren't abhorrent.
yeah, yeah, because they're popular, right? So if someone's like, I want to give everyone health, like, all right, well, how do we get there, right? Even like
Mm-hmm.
even when like bullshit like neolib Democrats say, oh, like, but how do we get there? How do we pay for it? Like they're already like giving us the framing, right? They're already saying,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so like this is a good thing, but how do we get there now? It means they're like the ball is in our court, right? Like we've
Mm-hmm.
shifted the conversation in a meaningful way, and I really like that. And so that's
Sure.
something that gives us an advantage over Republicans. You could say that Democrats who aren't you know of that philosophy and are of the triangulation. I can't fucking talk.
It's all good.
Triangulation philosophy. They will hold us back in a certain way. But again, I there's I'm sure you saw this meme, right, where it's like if you believe in this chart, you're wrong, and the idea is like it's Democrats and Republicans on either side of a chart, and it's like did the Democrats do something bad? Yes. Democrats suck.
Are you talking
And
about the
then,
meme
yeah,
I post?
yeah. Oh, that was you. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that was really good. Like, I love that shit. That was like, I mean, and, like that's perfect, right? Because again, I don't. It's very easy to say, oh, like they're an imperfect friend. I don't believe they're my friend, right? There's something that we can agree with on certain policy.
They're a vehicle.
Yeah,
I don't like
in
my
the
car. I just like getting there.
yeah, and again, if we can take over that party, I think that's like the best like avenue in for the immediate future, right? Again, I'm not saying this is the permanent solution. I've seen the Democratic Party drop the ball on class politics, and it's not fun to watch, right? But the only other opportunity. Oh, go ahead.
No, no, no. Well, actually, I guess to talk about the class politics thing a little bit. I know that one of the things I used to be, I came into leftism from more of like an anarchist side. I moved towards central planning, and I was definitely less in favor of like reformism at a period of time. And I know that definitely some of the studies I read while researching Gillens and Page, I think there's a few videos about that on my channel, showed that like the Democrats in particular are like a flawed, weakly pro worker, weakly pro poor polity. So like that kind of like de-radicalized me a little bit because it very much violates this idea that like, oh, it's all the one big capitalist party. No, it's like one party that's like weak and weakly follows like leftist goals. So again, it supported the idea of using them as a vehicle rather than seeing them as an end, and like so they're good enough in the short term, I guess, is the not good enough. They're almost they are useful in the short term.
Yes, and that's something that yeah, and again, I think that's where I disagree with some like the more harder like tankies or deontology people. And it's just again, like I understand your perspective. I just if I'm trying to think of like my like most basic axioms, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of my axioms is harm reduction and like making
Sure.
lives better, right? And if I can say, people like meme about like Biden will do like
He will drone strike
like
1,000 fewer children, right?
yes, like that's 1,000 children. We just saved 1,000 children. Like, is that
Mm-hmm.
like it's not enough, but it's better. And like again, like this isn't from like the. I think
I,
oh, go ahead.
Well, no. So I guess one of the things I thought was interesting is when I've talked to a lot of revolutionary type people, is I think one of the strongest points is that even if you want like a violent revolution, even if you want a big leftist movement that will sweep the Democrats out of power, it all seems like it gets easier when you have like center leftists in power who are less mean towards your movement, who cause less harm to your movement, right? Like if Biden weakens restrictions on unions, if he favors unions, if he gives money to poor people, all of these things should in general enable them to be more active in movements and more like radicalized in movements. So I guess it's just very frustrating to get these. Basically, I think that a lot of tankies and people who are anti-reform de facto end up at this accelerationist position where they want people to be in a suffering position so that they will be radicalized to the left.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
And I get that. I just one that's a lot of suffering people, and two, that's a dangerous dicey game. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like they could easily go fascist. That could especially like in the United States. Like there's so many like problems. Like that is a dangerous coin flip, and and personally, I'm not sure if I'm willing to do that. You know what I mean? Like if I had
Sure.
like if the chips are down and we're going fascist versus socialist, of course I'm gonna like fight, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that to have to be the option. I want the option to be we're slowly kicking the shit out of like these neolibs, and
Right.
conservatives aren't even a viable party, right? That's like immediate goals, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's safer for all the most vulnerable people in the meantime. And again, I'm not saying people don't suffer under capitalism. Obviously, people suffer under capitalism. Like our response
Mm-hmm.
for how like we've like how our government has responded to COVID and stuff has been absolutely atrocious. Like you have
Hmm.
tens of millions of people that are going to be homeless and out of work and stuff, and that's awful. And we can make it better. We're not going to fix it perfectly. Like even if Biden was in control, like obviously like things wouldn't be like perfect, but they would be better, right? And I
That's kind
think
of
that's
yes.
something. Yeah, and that's the struggle with like talking to deontologists, where it doesn't matter if you're like how much better it is if it's not perfect. And if some and like perfect like varies from like deontologist to deontologist, right? Like maybe
Hmm.
someone's perfect system is like just nationalized healthcare as opposed sorry, nationalized insurance as opposed to nationalized healthcare. And
Hmm.
that's like even like within deontology, unless everybody is like groupthink like on the exact same page, it's impossible.
You can't get
And like I don't
consensus. Yeah.
yeah, and like that's something that like consensus kind of needs to like happen, like or at least like a like a broader pool where the consensus is an acceptable thing to most parties involved. And like it's you go ahead. Sorry, I keep
No, no, no,
I'm just like
absolutely. No, so I very much agree with all the sentiments you've expressed here. So so I promised my sister I would play Minecraft with her, and we're coming up to that deadline. So if I was going to ask you to do two things at the end, maybe like one, if there's like one policy you wanted to see enacted in the United States, either a policy that would help move the United States left, like some sort of electoral reform, media reform, or a policy that would improve people's lives, that would enable your harm reduction. What would that policy be? And at the end, just give yourself a little shill. Tell us all who you are and how to get to you.
I got you. Um, I'd say the thing that would currently save the most lives and help the most people and have the largest societal effect
Mm-hmm.
would either be ending the drug war and decriminalizing all drugs and like shifting our infrastructure towards like rehabilitation as opposed to criminality,
Mm-hmm.
or universal healthcare. I think either of those
Seems
things
about
would
right.
like yeah, so like one of those two things like would dramatically improve the lives of everybody, and I think it's something that has like obviously broad-based appeal that most people could get behind, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's and it doesn't require massive fundamental shifts in our like it doesn't require overthrowing capitalism, right? So both those things are entirely
Yes.
acceptable inside a reformer framework. So I'd say like those are the two most reasonable, or sorry, pragmatic, not reasonable. I'm not saying like
Sure.
communists aren't reasonable. And then and that would help the most people. Like the tens of millions of people would be out of prison. Tens of millions of people would no longer go bankrupt from like medical expenses. And I think everyone would rest a little bit easier. And so those are my two things. And then again, personal shilling. I'll put this in
Mm-hmm.
the chat in a second. But my name is Hans from Hanz of Harkir. You can follow me on Twitter, Hanz of Harkir as well. I'll spell it in the chat because I can't spell. And then I also have my YouTube channel. If you want to help me get to 800 subs today, that would be super cool. I'm currently at 777. I have overpowered the mark of the beast. I'm no longer
Mm-hmm.
666, and that'd be great. I do like leftist book reviews content. Obviously, I do nonfiction book reviews again with history and economics. Economics is my bread and butter because I did like research for that. But I do all sorts of stuff in philosophy. I have a fun review of me just shitting on Jordan Peterson for 10 minutes, and
Based.
it's just and it was just it's a good time. Come learn shit with me. I do it once a week, and you don't have to like Patreon me or anything like that. I have a stable job, so you don't have to worry about financially supporting me. I just make this content because I enjoy it.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. And on the drug war note, right, this is a perfect reason that you guys should all vote for Biden, because guess what he's going to do? Decriminalize weed and purge all the people who had weed convictions. Wow, based, so based. And there's already a bill in the House to do it. God, if you haven't voted
So
Biden
based.
already in person or by mail, that would be so terrible, right? You'd be anti-weed. You'd be anti-gamer.
All right.
Um,
Thank you so much for having me. This was
Thanks
I
again.
really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks again for coming on. And I guess if you want to have another conversation anytime, I'd be happy to talk about. I think we talked a little bit about international trade as part of Monopoly, but I'd be happy to talk about like the reformist to socialism stuff. Yeah. All
Oh
right.
yeah, that'd be an amazing conversation. All right, thank you so much. This was
Absolutely.
fantastic.
Sure.
Vote
Go
blue.
sub to Hans. Okay. A lot of people in my chat want to marry you. Apparently. Oh my god.
I'll put some thirst traps in the chat in a bit. Don't worry.
Oh my
I see you.
god.
I hear you, and soon you're gonna be able to see me. Winky face. All right. I'm so sorry. All right.
Please engage
I'll
with this
catch you
man's
up.
brain. Okay, not anything below the belt. Please, I beg of you.